Para los que no me conocen, mi nombre es Juan Manuel España, yo soy investigador del grupo Energía, profesor de la Universidad de EIA y director de la Iniciativa de Energía Transactiva para Colombia. La Iniciativa de Energía Transactiva para Colombia es un conjunto de proyectos dentro de los cuales se enmarcan diferentes actividades de investigación, de educación, de colaboración, algunos proyectos pilotos en el campo de lo que ustedes van a ver en estas próximas semanas. Y una de las actividades clave de uno de los proyectos es este curso. Este curso hace parte de los objetivos de un proyecto que denominamos Smart Energy Education, un proyecto liderado por la Universidad de EIA en colaboración con University College London y el Ministerio de Minas y Energía y Neo Energy, la comercializadora de energía de Medellín. ¿Qué les puedo decir? Estamos pues, bastante contentos de ofrecer este espacio, que yo creo que son muy pocos los espacios académicos y educativos en donde se comparte este tipo de conocimiento, al menos aquí en Colombia, y que desde la Universidad de EIA venimos desarrollando y promoviendo desde hace varios años, más o menos 3 o 4 años. También me da mucho gusto ver algunos nombres conocidos, Carlos, Santiago, de diferentes instituciones financieras, académicas, empresas de energía, inclusive pues también investigadores de la Universidad de EIA, porque este campo de trabajo no es exclusivo de la ingeniería, es un campo transversal como lo es la energía y más en esta época que empezamos a ver el mundo de la energía desde la convergencia con otros sectores, desde la integración de nuevas tecnologías digitales y demás. Así que toda la participación de diferentes disciplinas nutre mucho la conversación. Ustedes hoy van a arrancar con el profesor David Shipworth y Alexandra Schneiders, que son líderes visibles a nivel mundial en este campo, desde el Observatorio Mundial de Intercambio de Energía entre Pares y Energía Transactiva de la Agencia Internacional de la Energía, y que verdaderamente han tomado la delantera en muchos aspectos desde University College London, con la experiencia y digamos con el recorrido del Reino Unido, y con quien hemos trabajado también desde hace un par de años, así que también nos place poder generar estos espacios de transferencia de conocimiento entre Colombia y el Reino Unido para que Colombia pueda aprovecharlos y pueda, digamos, seguir enfocando su transición energética en nuevos modelos de negocio, en innovación y en integración de los usuarios finales. Ahora, pues, sin robarle mucho tiempo a David y Alexandra, without wanting to take further time from you, David and Alexandra, I'm very happy to see you and to welcome you to our course. And I'm pretty sure that it's going to be a great start for the following weeks. We have people from different entities, from different backgrounds in this course, and we're very excited to share and to keep on promoting these kind of spaces and these kind of platforms that are rather new to Colombia, but we are confident that are pushing the conversation, the discussion around the integration of users, prosumers, and new technologies into energy systems. So welcome, David and Alexandra, and the floor is yours.
Hey, thank you, Juan Pablo. So what I would like to do is firstly just to say thank you to all for joining so early, Medellin time or Colombian time. It's just gone midday here in the UK, so it's fine for us, but I know it's very early for you. A couple of other points to raise. I don't speak any Spanish, but Alexandra does. So if you have any questions, you can put them into the chat box just in English or Spanish, whichever you're more comfortable with. And if they're in Spanish, Alexandra can translate them across for me. So please just, this is a lecture for your benefit. So do ask questions as we go along, and we will pause periodically and check that we're speaking at the right pace. If I'm speaking too quickly or using terms you don't understand, then please put something in chat or just ask questions about that, and we can pause and I can slow down, or we can explain the terms. So that aside, this lecture is broadly divided into 3 sections. The first section is around the energy transition itself. So this is, if you like, taking a very broad brush look over where we are in terms of energy, the energy system, and the need to decarbonize. Then it moves into a second section, which is focused more around user-centered energy systems. And that really looks at the role that users play within the energy system. And then I'll hand over to Alexandra, who will walk through and look at one of the major international research initiatives that we have, which is looking at how these different forms of user-centered energy system are, how they function, and how they're developing in different parts of the world. So that's an overview. The other thing I will raise is that currently where we are in terms of the global energy system is there is a great deal of uncertainty around how decarbonization will work and how it will work in different parts of the world. It's a fascinating time to be involved in the sector, but inevitably, when you try to fundamentally restructure something as important to everybody's lives and as big and expensive and complicated as the energy system, if you try to change that rapidly, then there will be all sorts of unintended consequences. We're seeing some of these in Europe at the moment. You'll be aware of the situation in the kind of Russia-Ukraine border. There is a challenge, an enormous challenge that is faced by Russia if Europe moves away from a reliance on carbon-based fuels. One of the single biggest revenue streams for the Kremlin is the income that comes from Gazprom and sales of gas through to Europe. So you can start to see, and it's important to remember that there are wider forces at work that will shape how we go through this process of decarbonization than simply the technical merits of different forms of technologies. We need to ask ourselves about, at a geopolitical level, which parties are going to gain, which parties are going to lose out, and how that will play out in terms of relationships between countries. That, I think, is something that we've yet to really see. The other thing, which I'll talk more about, is we are about to have the biggest impact of the energy system on average people's lives that they've ever experienced, and how the public understands and responds to these changes will have a big impact on what governments are capable of delivering. So that's a very large-scale overview. I think there's a famous Chinese saying of, may you live in interesting times. And I think it's very much the case in the energy sector at the moment that we live in very interesting times. So I think that's important to bear in mind when one thinks about the energy transition. So assuming that my slides are working and we've just gone on to the next slide, I think from what I kind of caught, I was briefly introduced, but to talk a little bit about me. So I'm a professor of energy in the built environment at University College London within the Energy Institute at UCL. I'm also chair of a body called the User-Centered Energy Systems, which is one of the technology collaboration programs run by the International Energy Agency. So under that, we have currently 15 countries that participate. It's an intergovernmental organization of member countries. So yes, so I was saying I'm also chair of this intergovernmental body that looks at the role of users within the put a largest possible view on what is driving the energy transition. And this for me is important because it kind of puts certain things as becoming inevitable. So once we decide we need to decarbonize, and we choose a particular way of doing that, which is through low density intermittent supplies like solar photovoltaic and wind, then that currently is the cheapest way to decarbonize, but it immediately creates some issues. So because they are low density, we have to physically distribute them over a much larger area. So we end up with lots of smaller generators rather than fewer larger generators. But because they're intermittent, effectively we have to take the energy when it is generated, rather than use the generation to follow the load. So as soon as you choose to decarbonize with PV and wind predominantly, you move immediately into a distributed energy system. And that causes energy to flow in multiple directions on the electricity networks. So you get bidirectional energy flows. Now, to manage that, you need to start putting in a lot of digital infrastructure. So we have to be able to monitor when generation is entering the grid. We have to be able to manage the demand to follow the supply. We need to monitor the conditions on the grid in terms of voltage and current and line limits and a whole range of other factors very closely. So you need to start to have much more control than you used to for managing the grid. So that leads us into digitalizing a range of things. As soon to also look at having flows of energy around the edges of the grid, then they tend to be much smaller volumes of flows. So we need to be able to exchange energy at a much lower cost. But we, at the very edges of the grid, just changing some 10 hours of electricity. Now, that doesn't have a lot of financial value. So in those smaller amounts of energy, we have to be able to automate that and to take out a lot of the costs associated with that. And that's called disintermediation. We need to find a way to trade large numbers of small packages of energy and have that all balance out at the grid edge. Because we are doing that, then we are starting to interfere in everybody's lives. So it's very difficult to have all of these distributed energy resources in different areas and not impact on people through planning permission processes, through wanting them to provide flexibility and support for when they're charging their vehicles or heating their homes or selling their locally generated energy. So you start to have to engage a lot more people to have a functioning energy system. So then you have to democratize. We're also in a changing culture where people are expecting to be delivered services rather than products. So want to have their electricity delivered in a way that provides them with particular services, and they expect high levels of customer support. So that again is changing the social around how we deliver and engage with energy. And then finally, the last one, differentiated. As soon as we start to have lots of local supply, then we start to need to change the nature of energy. So every kilowatt hour is not the same. Some have different carbon contents. Some are much better at supporting local community initiatives. We also vary it by place. So if you consume energy near where it's generated, you would want to pay less for that. And also, if you're consuming energy at the times when it's generated, you should pay less for that as well. So it's differentiated by value and place and time. Alexandra, I notice there's a question in the chat. Are you able to translate that one for me?
I think so. Basically, it was Juan saying that I'm there to pick up questions because there seems to be no Q&A. So it's just people can ask questions in the chat. And yeah, so we welcome any questions you may have in the chat. So don't hesitate to write them, also in Spanish.
That's great. Thank you for that. Next slide, please. So just to take a broad look at the energy transition, one of the resources I find very useful is something from the World Energy Council. Every year, they do a survey of around, I think, 3,000 of the most senior people in the energy sector worldwide. And they ask them to think about the things that they think have the highest uncertainty. So these are things they feel are important, but they don't know much about, and the ones that they think might have the greatest impact on how they do their job in the future. Now, on the diagram, what you're seeing there is the more things are over on the right-hand side and up towards the top, the more these are things that are keeping the leaders of the energy sector awake at night that they worry about. The ones you're seeing in blue are the things they spend most of their time actually working on during the day. So you see quite a difference between the sort of daytime preoccupations of the leading people in the sector and the things they think might cause substantial change. This was back in 2020, and you started to see all sorts of issues like data and artificial intelligence, the use of Internet of Things and distributed ledger technologies or blockchains, the role of US policy, commodity prices, questions around economic growth. These are all the things that the sector's leaders are most worried about. So it's a good barometer, if you like, of the direction that we may be heading. Next slide, please. If we go forward to 2021, they slightly changed the format, but of course now we have the coronavirus and the global pandemic. So that has reprioritized what the people in the sector are worried about. So now they're much more worried about things like economic trends and the impacts of the borrowing that countries have had to do to meet the costs of the coronavirus pandemic. They're worried about security of supply, of cybersecurity risks. So this one, I think, is perhaps slightly atypical, and we might expect that once the pandemic settles down, then some of these issues will reduce. But I do think that security of supply will remain one of the most important ones because, as I was saying, the energy transition is hugely disruptive to the power structures, both at a geopolitical level, but also in terms of the companies operating within the sector. So there's a lot of concern about how the big oil majors will transition to find a new role in a decarbonized economy, and the extent to which they will fight against any transition will be important in thinking about how long any transition will take. Next slide, please. A few more figures to give an overview. There's also a couple of covers of International Energy Agency publications on the right-hand side that are worth looking at. I'll quote, I think, from both of these, but the major one was the Digitalization and Energy Report. And there's an ongoing program of work at the IEA around digitalization and energy. It's an area that I think all of you need to pay quite close attention to. So this was from World Economic Forum that we're looking at over 2.4 trillion of value from the transformation of the electricity sector over the next 10 years. So that's the costs and value associated with decarbonization and its impact on the electricity sector. We're already at a point now where renewables are the cheapest way to generate energy. It's important with renewables, and here I'm particularly referring to intermittent renewables like wind and solar, that they create a lot of costs elsewhere in the system. So they're very cheap to generate, but because they are intermittent, there's a lot of work in balancing their generation against demand and transmitting it through networks. So there are costs, they're just in other parts of the system. But still, the fact that we've now got that lower one where we're down below 2 cents per kilowatt hour for large scale solar now is amazing. Even nobody would have believed we would be close to that price point, and certainly not 20 years ago. We're expecting major institutional and regulatory disruption. This we will come back to. The regulation of the sector will have to change, and change rapidly and very substantially if we are to successfully decarbonize. This is a highly regulated sector, and necessarily so. It will always remain a highly regulated sector, and we can't transition to low carbon without changing the regulations that the sector is governed by. And we're already seeing more investment in digitalization than we are in traditional carbon-based, say, gas-fired power generation. So the big money, the big investments are all going into how we optimize the management of the grid through the use of digital technologies. Next slide, please. This is from another publication that is always worth being aware of. It's called the World Energy Outlook. It is the flagship publication of the International Energy Agency. And what they're looking at here are the estimated market sizes for different forms of clean energy technologies in different geographic regions. So the takeaway from this is that if we are to achieve net zero, and the IEA did an excellent recent report on net zero by 2050, which is also a very important document to understand, then we're going to have to spend a lot of money in certain forms of clean energy technologies. So again, when you think about your careers and your lifetime, you will be operating in the sector between now and 2050. So you will be coming into positions where you are senior people within the sector by 2030, and you will be leading the sector through from 2030 to 2050, while this huge change and investment is going on. So understanding that direction of change, where we currently think the investment will be is important. But again, I come back to the point that all of these projections are based on computer scenarios constructed and run on, by the International Energy Agency. None of these models previously predicted how rapidly solar and wind would reduce in cost. So it's worth bearing this in mind. If we had looked at something like this that was done, say, 20 years ago, the composition of technologies would look very different because we didn't know how rapidly certain technologies would become cheaper. And that's the thing that constantly surprises us. We think we understand how the economics of these kind of systems work, but frequently we get it quite wrong. So it might look like this, but the mix of technologies may end up looking substantially different. Next slide. This is another take from the Energy EIA Digitalization Energy Report. Again, it's reflecting the differences from the way we have historically worked at the top and the way we will need to work down the bottom. So again, the broad picture is the same. What we're seeing is a move from hydrocarbon-based centralized systems where we dispatch energy to meet demand, and that demand is inflexible. What we're starting to move towards is, on the demand side, we're going from inflexible demand through much more flexibility. And this is, again, where we come to a lot of the user-centered energy systems and what happens at smaller scales in cities and in buildings. So demand response becomes more flexible for larger consumers initially, and then we get aggregators in the sector that pull together thousands of smaller consumers and get them providing flexibility. And then we move across to the right where we see aggregators, prosumers, and integration of demand much more completely into the network. On the bottom, you're seeing the same shift from left to right, but moving from centralized supply through competitive market, much more distributed generation, and then the mechanisms to manage that, things like using blockchains or distributed ledgers, vehicle to grid, to balance and make the whole system work in a way that much more resembles, say, how the internet works. Lots of distributed components that talk to each other in real time using AI and various control algorithms. So that's another sweep through the big changes as we move from the left-hand side of present towards what the future grid will look like. Next slide, please. So the fundamental takeaways from this report were the need for much greater flexibility. And this has been the main thing that we are seeing and continues to be the focus for governments around the world, is how we get the demand side to provide the flexibility we need to help match the intermittent generation on the supply side. We see enabling consumers to interact directly with the system, creating and balancing these loads. So here we see a lot about how we construct local energy markets. And this has been central to the work that Alexandra will talk about when we talk about the work of the Global Observatory on local energy models. So that has to happen. We have to have people who are either actively or at least passively engaged in this process. We need to have this kind of active participation of consumers across all of the demand sectors. So it's something that isn't just in buildings, but will be in transport and automotive. And that then allows this integration of intermittent renewables. Electric vehicles, again, at the top level, we will see a transfer to electric vehicles much more quickly than anybody has ever imagined. And that is because it is now essential, if you're a vehicle manufacturer, to be effectively swapping over to making as many electric vehicles as possible. The problem will be is that it's easier to produce the vehicles than it is to produce the infrastructure to recharge them. So we have a challenge as to how we provide enough charging points, how we reinforce the electricity network to be able to provide the power needed for electric vehicles. We often say in the UK that once you put an electric vehicle and a heat pump into a home, you're basically at least tripling the amount of electricity that home will need. And in many parts of the world, the electricity networks simply aren't strong enough to be able to support that. So there's a risk there that we persuade people to move to electric vehicles, but they have a very bad user experience because the charge points in the networks aren't there to support those. And the final point of their top level findings from this was enabling customers to engage in local energy trading. And that's where most of our work focuses, is how do you make local energy trading attractive and easy for regular people in households and businesses? And being easy is essential. They are not interested in the technologies. They're not interested in making their lives more complicated. They need really well-designed, simple, engaging user experiences to make them help us balance the grid. Next slide, please. Again, this was from something that was published by a colleague of mine at the EIA. So this is Emma Bertoli. She is involved, she oversees from the IEA's perspective, the work that goes on within the user-centered energy systems, TCP. Again, looking here at the sorts of business models we might expect to see change as a result of the transition. I won't go through all of these, but we can see that we have a range of traditional business models on the left that are focused around physical products. So somebody wants to sell you a washing machine, a microwave oven, a physical object. And the way we look at this is that really what we do is people want services, people want clean dishes, they want warm cooked meals. They don't want a microwave oven. What they do is they feed energy into a physical device to get the service they want at the other end. And increasingly, they want to just buy the service. They don't want to clutter up their homes with the physical devices and be responsible for converting energy into services using these lumps of technology in the middle. So there'll be a shift towards service-based models. We will see a huge difference in the way we collect and manage data. We have seen enormous growth in the need for data scientists within the energy sector. So again, that will be a huge area of importance. Looking at a shift from sort of things defined by hardware to software models. Again, I won't go through the rest of them, but you can start to see when you look at both of these sides, you can see the forms of enterprise we expect to come into this space. At the end of the day, we think that you will always have the physical hardware that is generating and transmitting energy, but the real growth in the sector comes on the services that can be built on top of the information that comes from digitalizing the sector to provide services to people rather than simply the product that is energy. Next slide, please. So to look at the sector's challenges, and here I think, again, we're talking big picture. There's a few that I want to run through here. So the four main challenges I think that the sector faces is, the first is around recruiting the talent that they need. So currently, particularly the hydrocarbon parts of the energy sector are seen as socially regressive. They have aging populations, predominantly male workers. They're not areas that people necessarily want to work in. So we have this question of how do we create an industry that is attractive to the best talent? And as part of that, they need to be seen as a solution to social and climate problems, not as part of the problem itself. We have, as we've talked about, this difference between who owns the assets. There was a study by Bloomberg which showed that one of the biggest differences in the energy sector in 2050 is that most of the assets will be owned by private individuals. They will be people with electric vehicles and heat pumps and storage facilities, etc. So you have a movement of the assets needed to make the grid work behind the meter or into private homes or into private hands. So it's a really fundamentally different way of thinking about energy system. Historically, it's always been owned by professional large-scale actors. Now those assets will be in the hands of private individuals, and we have to ensure that they're willing to allow those assets to work in the system. Consumer engagement. We need to be able to create offerings that are actually attractive to people. And this is the area that I think is one of the most challenging, is what gets people interested or at least willing to participate in this process. So we have to create value for people. And through regulation, we have to restructure the way we regulate. I'll talk more about that, but it's more about how we say what we want industry to provide rather than telling industry what they have to do to provide it. Before we jump on, there's a question room. Yes. Okay, great. That's from you. Okay, you're just prompting them. Thanks, Alexandra.
It's actually from me. Yeah.
Yeah, that's cool. Okay, next slide, please. I'm struggling slightly with the cold, so I'll need to mute and cough periodically. So yeah, just to look at each of those. The first is around this issue of how we create an industry which will attract the best talent. The important thing to understand here is the industry is now competing with the IT sector, because so many of the skills are really focused on understanding the data that comes off the digital technologies and around creating customer services and new offerings. Exactly the same people can choose to either work in the energy sector or to work for Google or Facebook. So that is a huge challenge, because the salaries that are paid in the IT sector are far higher than have historically been paid in the energy sector. So it's an open question as to how this sector, the energy sector, competes to attract the best people. To do that, I think that it really needs to be seen as part of the solution to climate and social problems. And currently it's not. And this is where I think once we move to looking at local energy systems, it will become more obvious that we can help solve these problems. So that, I think, is the direction of travel. Next slide, please. Aha, you'll have to, thank you. Yeah, I want to click through this. Stop there for a sec, thank you. So one of the biggest challenges is again around social equity. And this is a slightly complicated slide to understand, but the more I've thought about this, the more important it will become. So currently within the energy system, we charge people a small amount to connect to the electricity system. And that small amount is a fixed charge, which reflects things like the costs of the power stations and the networks, etc. But mostly what people pay in most countries is a price per kilowatt hour. Now, historically, that's because power stations are cheap to build and expensive to run. Now, that's the historic cost structure, but if you move on, just keep clicking through and we'll grab a couple more of the, keep going, there might be some more. Yeah, okay, one more. No, keep going, we'll just finish it off. One more click, there we are. Okay, thanks, we'll pause there. Oops, back one. Great. But that is changing fundamentally. So if you look at the blue lines now, we are constructing an energy system which is very expensive to build, but costs almost nothing to run. So what you end up with is a high capital expenditure to construct everything, but the OPEX, the operational expenditure, is much lower. You need to maintain it. There are still costs associated with that. So you get these two different lines that reflect the real costs of the different energy sectors, of the different energy systems. And those cross at a certain point, and that's that green box that says that's the point at which somebody who uses exactly that amount of energy would pay the same amount under either cost structure. The problem is that if you use more energy, so you're on the right-hand side, then effectively you're paying more for your energy than you should under the current cost structure of price per kilowatt hour. So you start to subsidize those people who use less than that fair payment point. The challenge we have, and this all governments will wrestle with this, is that if we start to introduce local energy systems, then while the amount of energy that they consume might be the same, the amount they buy from the grid will go down. So if you install a photovoltaic array and a battery, you start to buy much less energy from the grid because you're generating it internally. The issue there is that in terms of what the grid sees, your energy consumption has reduced. So effectively, those people who can't afford to buy photovoltaic arrays and batteries end up supporting those people who can afford to buy those. So that creates a social inequity, and governments won't be willing to have poor people who don't have the capital assets to buy these pieces of equipment cross-subsidizing wealthier people who do. So this is really where we get to the heart of some of the issues that come up in some of the projects that we've been supporting the people at EIA in doing. So the Transactive Energy Colombia projects and this project itself. So this is one of the issues we're trying to solve. How do we get an equitable outcome depending on who has the capital to buy and install and operate these assets? It's one of the really big challenges. And if you're looking at from a social perspective, we need to solve this. And currently we don't know how to do it. Next slide, please. So the other major challenge that we see is that historically, the energy system has been really focused on minimizing costs. So this works on the assumption that all kilowatt hours of electricity are exactly the same, and nobody cares whether the kilowatt hour was produced locally or a long way away. They don't care whether it was produced by burning coal or gas or hydropower or wind or any other method. They don't care whether the company that generated it was, looked after its workers or didn't look after its workers. That is all starting to change, and we need to move away from that kind of a worldview to one where we start thinking about what do end consumers want and how can we create the most value for them, both in terms of providing services rather than just energy, but also ensuring that when we do provide energy, it's the kind of energy they want. So what other attributes, do they want low carbon energy? Do they want energy that supports their local community, that helps people who might be in fuel poverty? We can now start to create much more value for people by looking at the mixture of energy plus data and the energy attributes that are attached to that. So we will need to do that because we want people to participate. And the only way to get people to participate is either to force them to through legislation or to make products that are attractive enough that they choose to participate. And in most countries, it will be done through people choosing to participate. Next slide, please. So this is building on the previous one. And again, it's this question of cost minimization versus value maximization. This comes back to the question of how we design the software platforms and how we create value for people that goes beyond the energy. So I've talked a bit about some of the sort of energy attributes around this, but there's a lot of social science and psychology and financial engineering that will go into thinking about how to present new products and services to consumers. We also have some interesting opportunities that we know that the more people feel they are in control of their energy, the more likely they are to want to engage and manage that energy. So we have to design systems which empower people and give them a sense of capacity to manage and balance their own energy within the system. So a lot of this is so different to what the energy sector has historically done and starts to look more like the way in which we see social media platforms operating, and looking at particularly the kind of psychology of value for participants. And again, this question of, I've had various discussions with policymakers in the UK and elsewhere that they won't allow those that have the financial and technical expertise to effectively create their own mini energy systems and not engage in the wider energy system, because the fear for politicians is that the more you get what we call sort of energy gated communities, or people who just install their own assets and operate them, the more likely we are to end up in a situation where only the poor are connected to networks and only the poor are paying for those networks. Next slide, please. Okay, I'll need to speed up a bit to sort of keep on track in terms of the lecture. So again, the other thing that is a big dynamic in this sector, which I think many of you might have come across, is there is a need to change the culture. So currently, when we have discussions within the sector, you have those that are coming in from outside, particularly from ICT sectors, those that are used to digital platforms and dealing with information technology. They want to change things really quickly. But the existing system does not want to change really quickly. And there's some good reasons for that. A colleague of mine who worked for research and development for EDF, the big predominantly nuclear company, had a wonderful picture of a nuclear reactor with a fuel rod being lifted out of the core of the reactor. And then he had a kind of the classic quote from Mark Zuckerberg saying, "Move fast and break things," which is exactly what you don't want to do when you're dealing with nuclear fuel in a reactor. So there are these different timescales that the sector is working on, and the two cultures of the sector, one is very conservative and one is very frustrated at how slowly things move. So we have to reconcile that.
Sorry, David, there are two questions.
That's excellent. All right, okay. So let's take those one at a time. So the first is there a challenge regarding the availability of information? For example, when you were speaking on choosing what type of energy the consumer wants to use. Yes, there is. Particularly, I think currently we struggle around correctly communicating the carbon intensity of energy. Currently, we have two separate ways of telling customers how much carbon is in their electricity, and they give very different numbers. So there's a challenge there about how we account for carbon within the energy system. We have no real way of accounting for what is local. So we can start to say, yes, this energy was generated near, in theory, it's easy to say where the energy was generated, but currently we're not really attaching geographic information about generation and consumption into the way we trade energy. We're doing it very locally in some pilot schemes. So this is where we need to start thinking about how do we track and trace energy through the energy system, and what attributes do we connect to that energy to show that it might have value for different participants. So it is a challenge. Lots of people are working on it. I'd suggest looking at Energy Tag, which is an initiative to track and trace energy, and United Nations Environment Programs just also launched a new one to try and do this using distributed ledgers. Next question, does the necessary hardware already exist to have a self-balancing decentralized network? Excellent. I think the answer is that the hardware exists. Most of the time, the challenge is not in the sort of individual pieces of hardware level. It's mostly around how we communicate information that would support that. So it's about interoperability of different systems. Most systems, say battery storage systems, have the capacity to charge or discharge in receipt of a signal, but we need to get all of the signals correctly lined up at a system-wide level. So the hardware, I think, is there. What isn't there is a lot of the interoperability, the software protocols, and then there's also not enough capacity to predict future generation and demand and match those two. One more. How can we make consumers aware of the necessity of this challenge, especially in zones where hydro is predominant? Very good question, to which I don't have an answer. I am more aware of this in the UK situation, where part of the challenge is our very old network that can't support a lot of new renewables. Hydro is an interesting one. Hydro is part of the solution, but it's the uptake is driven by different factors. So there are other environmental concerns around large-scale hydro and the cost concerns of its construction. So I might actually flag that one up a bit for the EIA team to think about in terms of the hydro. But I think part of this is about information transparency and provision, so that people can start to be aware of where their energy comes from and the impacts of that. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so I'll jump through a couple more. So yeah, the broad lesson here is that the current system is almost perfectly designed to disengage customers, particularly if people are paying using direct debit schemes. They don't see the impact on their bills, particularly for those for whom paying bills is not necessarily something that's a particular financial burden. But also, I think we've deliberately tried to make electricity as boring as possible, precisely because of the nature of the system that we've had to generate it. So we've kind of designed a system to bore our customers, and changing that around to actually start prioritizing what customers want is a huge challenge for the sector. Next slide, please. The other thing which I want to talk briefly about is the regulatory challenge. We have to change the way the sector is regulated. And one of the real challenges there is that over time, regulation gets more and more complicated. This is slightly out of date, but it's a map of the regulating parties and the relationships in the UK energy system. And we currently have over around 6,000 pages of regulations governing how people have to act. Given that the whole sector is really driven by regulation, then we can't change the system without changing the regulatory environment. That's the top level lesson. I think the next slide goes a bit more detail. So next slide, please. We're starting to see this change in Europe. So when the EU introduced the 4th electricity directive, they changed quite a lot about how individuals can participate in the system. So you'll see the main takeaway from this slide is if you look at the bottom one, which represents the 4th electricity directive, then you'll see lots of green ticks, which are saying how individual prosumers and collective prosumers can start to participate in the market directly. And that for you is completely changing how we engage with consumers who are also producing. So collective prosumers are really groups of people who want to balance their own energy internally within their system. So we are seeing regulated change. What we have yet to see is how this will work in practice in many situations. Next slide, please. What we need to do in terms of regulation is to move away from telling the industry what to do, which we call prescriptive regulation, towards telling the industry what outcomes we want. So that's kind of performance-based regulation. So we start to say, we require you to produce electricity that has the following characteristics. It might be a certain carbon intensity for that electricity. And we start having far fewer regulations, but ones which really focus on the outcomes that we want to achieve. And then we let the industry work out the most cost-effective way of delivering the outcome. That has benefits and risks for various parties. So what happens here is that industry then has to demonstrate that it has met the performance criteria. And so if it fails to, often this will come back to legal disputes and case-based law resolution. But currently we stifle the innovation in the sector because the regulation is so tightly defined around what you're allowed to do that new ideas aren't allowed to come up. So this is a big shift, and it's very scary for governments because they are releasing their control over the sector, and things will go wrong. We just have to be able to identify things that are going wrong very quickly and then work out how to change and manage that. Next slide, please. So to do that, we need to start to measure things much more rapidly. And this comes back to digitalization. So if regulators want to release control, they have to be able to see what's happening. Historically, they haven't been able to see what's happening on the energy networks. They don't know who is being advantaged, who is not, who is making unreasonable profits out of this process. So to change that, this is where digitalization comes in. They will be able to see what different companies are doing and who is benefiting and who is not from the process. So that is the benefit of digitalization in conjunction with regulatory or principles-based regulatory change. Next slide, please. Again, it's basically the benefit there is this idea that you need to come up with an idea about the way regulation works. And then the technologies we're seeing emerging, and some of which we're using with our EIA colleagues, are around things like Internet of Things and artificial intelligence and oracle networks that allow us to independently monitor and verify the outcomes that we want to achieve as a society. So that's where I think it gets exciting, because you could require industry to install this technology and to give the regulator the data that comes from that, so that the industry can prove it has met the requirements and the regulator can have reassurance that nobody is being made worse off as a result of this process. Then once you have that data, you can do lots of other things like build new businesses on the back of it. It can be anonymized and made public, and new entrants can come in and look at opportunities to deliver new services through that. And all of this is made possible by these technology changes, particularly around Internet of Things, oracle networks, artificial intelligence, cryptographic approaches, and distributed ledgers. Next, please. Okay, so that was a run through for the first part of it. I'm running behind schedule. I probably will not talk to all of these because, Alexandra, I was thinking I should leave you at least half an hour to talk about the observatory. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, 20, 30 minutes. I mean, if you have run a little bit, that's fine by me.
Okay, I'm just going to pause for a second and have a brief catch of breath and a drink of some water. Yeah. There we are. That's great. Okay, so we've painted a big picture around what has driven changes in the energy system. And it all comes back to decarbonization and our choice to use intermittent forms for decarbonization in much of the world. I've also said what that means in terms of the technology to support that. And a lot of this comes down to digitalization and this raft of new capacities and technologies that we have. It does create challenges. I haven't talked about cybersecurity threats and other bits and pieces, but yeah, that's the direction of travel. So I've just noticed another question in chat. The Colombian regulation rewards renewable energy. What is the risk in the future that we get used to incentives? Yes, another excellent question. There's a long history of the study of the role of incentives, and they can lead to socially unusual or perverse outcomes. You're right. People can start to think that they are entitled to incentives. We've seen this with a lot of feed-in tariffs in Europe, where people were paid a lot of to install solar by getting paid a lot for the output from their energy systems. The problem was then that it became unsustainable to maintain that as the prices fell. So I think as we get more and more renewables on the system, it becomes less and less socially or economically viable to sustain subsidies. But people often to the subsidies and continue to want them. So I think managing exit from subsidies is a huge problem. It's absolutely crippling parts of the Middle East. The Middle East has historically heavily subsidized citizens' use of power. And now they're in a situation where they have to take people off that. I think the main thing there is clear communication about when you'll reduce a subsidy. So people, when they start, they understand the conditions under which they will no longer be able to have that subsidy. And it's part of a bigger social debate about where priorities should lie. So no easy answers on that one, but it's easy in some senses to subsidize, and it's often hard to extract from having done so. So yeah, a huge area again to think about research. Right, next slide, please. Oops. Okay, so when we start to think about user-centered energy systems, it starts to become interesting because we start to move into the area where what people expect is defined by the energy system they have experienced, and what people experience is defined by the changes in the energy system. So you get into this loop, and these are what's called sociotechnical systems. So if we sort of move around this diagram sort of from the top, what we know is that existing social structures determine the sorts of technologies that people are willing to develop. So you can only really develop new technologies that you think people will socially accept. What that means is that we develop technologies that we think people will like, and those technologies then shape the way people act. So they change individuals' behaviors, and that then reinforces the sorts of things that people are willing to accept. So we get this kind of what's often called a lock-in loop, where we see the technologies but also, the social structures determine sort of people's preferences. things that are socially acceptable in one country are completely unsocially acceptable in other countries. The kind of tariff structures in Colombia would cause riots in the UK if we tried to introduce something like your strata-based tariff structures. But they make perfect sense and they work socially within the Colombian context. So both the technical possibilities and preferences shape these individuals' behaviors. So the trick that we face when we think about user-centered energy systems is, how do we get out of this self-reinforcing loop between what people say they want and the sorts of technologies people develop? I will often have this debate with people in industry and in government, where they say, well, tell us what people need and we will provide it, without understanding that what people need and what people want depends on their available choices and their experience. And people are generally not very good at imagining different ways of doing things. They get very attached to the way they have historically always done things and are very resistant to any kind of change, even if those changes may be better for them immediately. People socially don't like things to change. And people tend to see what currently exists as being fair. And very often what currently exists is very unfair. And as soon as you try to change it, all those people who currently benefit start to complain very quickly. So we have to break out of this weird reinforcement loop that we get. And it's a question of how we go about doing that. Next slide, please. Yeah, pause there. So the other thing that's really important in this process is that we have in the center of this certain images, certain kind of imaginations of who people are and what people want. And these are very simplified images. So traditionally in this sector, the image has been of the sort of economic, rational man. And I use man deliberately there because quite often these are strongly gendered kind of roles, and the people who are designing systems design them for people like themselves, which are again predominantly, historically, sort of male engineers. So you get this question of, well, what images do people have of their customers, of their users, when they develop technologies? And at a very basic level, when we put in place smart thermostats, when we come up with ways of charging electric vehicles, we make assumptions about the users, that they have a certain amount of technical knowledge, that they have a certain physical dexterity, that they have, that they are people who are sighted, people who can read technical manuals. And all of those assumptions get embedded into the technologies that we develop, and then they benefit some people and they disbenefit others. But one of the really strong ones we have is this belief that humans are economically rational and they will always simply act to minimize their costs. And there's lots of evidence now that that is actually not the case. And people care as much about their social relationships and what they think is fair treatment for others as they do about their economic benefits. The irony in the UK is that most energy consumers are paying about £250 more than they need to, but they couldn't be bothered changing energy suppliers to find cheaper rates. And it drives economists completely mad that these people aren't behaving the way their models tell them that they should. So that's a really important component here. When we design technologies, what assumptions are we making about our users, and how do they need to change in order to engage users? Next slide, please. So one way we have of breaking this down is to think about a process that is widely used in energy economics, which is something called the Kaya identity, which some of you may be familiar with. But it's a very simple equation that basically breaks down energy consumption into a series of factors. So you can multiply energy intensity, which is the energy input per unit service, by consumption intensity, so the number of service units per person, and multiply it by the population. So hugely widely understood and used approach. Next slide, please. One thing you can do with this is start to extend it in either direction. So the same basic idea, but towards the left-hand side, you can start to turn that into looking at greenhouse gas emissions. So moving away from energy and towards how much greenhouse gas is released per unit of energy, and how that translates into the impacts on the environment. On the right-hand side, you can extend it to, instead of looking at people, you can start to look at households. Important when we start to think about the role of users, because often decisions are taken by households or companies, not by individual people, particularly when we think about energy use in the built environment. And then you can scale that up and say, well, what about communities? Is the natural way to think about this the individual person, the household, or the social unit, the community? And increasingly, we think as we distribute our energy and we digitize, we need to think about different units. We need to think about households and think about communities. Next slide, please. So one way we've used is, you can start to pull these things apart. You can look at how the greenhouse gas emissions are pulled apart into primary energy, transmitted energy, and delivered energy. So you can break each of these down further. Next slide, please. Particularly, we're interested in the role of users in two of these ratios. The first one is energy intensity, and you can break that down and start thinking about what goes into this question of energy intensity. So we look at it in terms of how do we decide the energy systems that we want to have in the future. We're really interested in smart local energy systems, local energy trading. So how do you think about the energy required depending on how you design the system that you have? The system itself is made up of a range of individual technology choices, which was one of the questions that was raised. So you can assemble a local energy system out of all sorts of different technical components. With each of those, you have the choice of technology, and you have the kind of efficiency. So you have a theoretical efficiency for a particular piece of technology or a particular system. And that is different from the efficiency that you observe in the real world once you install that. So the efficiency of a solar array on paper or in a factory is very different to what you get once it's got trees growing around it and the glass on the top of it's all dirty and some of the connectors are broken. So you've got this big difference between the designed efficiency and the manufacturing efficiency. When you start putting people in here, then people never use technologies the way engineers assume. That gets back to that image that the engineer or the designer has of the person and the assumptions they make about them. So the manufacturer or designer has certain assumptions about behavior that differs from actual behavior. So you get these hugely frustrated users who can't get this ridiculous piece of smart control technology to do what they want it to do because they think it works or should work one way, and the designer has made different sets of assumptions. So you get this real difference between the assumed behavior and the actual behavior. And then it's the actual behavior that drives how well the user can convert that energy into actual services. If you can't use a bit of technology to do what you want it to do, it's not providing the services that you need. So whether you've got a really complicated smart home controller, so you just give up and open your windows because do that, then try to work out how this ridiculously complicated piece of technology works. So at every one of those stages, users play an essential role in the ultimate energy consumption of the system. And that's all the way back through the designing, planning choices, manufacturing choices, and assumptions. Next slide, please. The other one we think is really important is this question of consumption intensity. So this is how much do people choose to use? How much do I choose to fly? How much, do I have a meat-based diet? Do I have a much more vegetable-based diet? That gets really into the whole areas of social psychology, behavioral economics, behavioral sciences, and it depends also on the environments in which people find themselves. For me, I now cycle everywhere because I find cycling far more enjoyable than taking the bus. But that's in large measure determined because in London, people have been installing cycle lanes. So now all of a sudden, it feels much safer for me to travel by bike. So it's a function of the environment that I sit in. I make choices depending on the physical environments. It's determined by things like, when my employer wants me in the office, if you've got kids, when you need to drop them off to school, when holidays are scheduled, the physical infrastructure, but also social expectations. Would I be basically seen as being kind of slightly crazy if I took my rollerblades out and went and rollerbladed to work instead of being on my bike? I might expect people to laugh at me, so I wouldn't do that. So each of these different things determines how much of a service we will use and which services we will choose. So there's a whole area here that's really important about how we design systems to help people make the right low energy, low carbon sets of choices. Next slide, please. That flows through into now how we think about the whole question of technology innovation and diffusion. We used to think of it as this very linear model, which is your classic research, development, demonstration, and deployment model. But now we realize, and this is a slide from the International Energy Agency, that in fact, that whole process is much more agile and circular, or it should be. So you need constant feedback from users when you're doing the research, when you're doing the development and testing. And unless you have those people participating through society approval of your technologies through to end users, it's not going to work and it won't get adopted. So we're moving much more towards more sort of agile, user-centered development processes to make sure that people opt in to the technologies that we produce. Next slide, please. I think this is just about the last couple from me. This was some work that a colleague of Alexandra and mine has done. This is Nicole Watson, who's doing a PhD for us. she was looking at how interested people in the UK would be to have multiple energy suppliers. So we did some social experimental work, and we basically we asked people, say we were to opt you into having two suppliers. By default, you have two suppliers. How many people would stay with the two suppliers if we just automatically moved you onto them? And overwhelmingly, 85% said yes, they would basically stay with their multiple supplier model. Give them the choice, we have to say you have to choose between a conventional model or a multi-supplier model. Still, the vast bulk of people wanted multiple supplier models. If we actually forced them to just choose one or the other, still most people would jump towards having basically a background supplier with a local supplier pitched in. So what we're finding is there's huge demand, at least through this kind of research approach, to be able to have a national supplier and a local supplier. And so that really sets the groundwork for thinking about how we establish local energy suppliers. Next slide, please. And again, this was more evidence from the same, basically the same piece of research, that again, we're seeing that we have this really strong preference, but it depends who approaches you. So if your current national energy supplier approaches you and says, we would like to offer you the opportunity to have a local supplier, people really, really like that. If you actually get a local supplier saying, we would like to represent you and we will offer you the opportunity for a national supplier, they're much less happy with that. So it's curious, there is a conservatism still. People want the security of a national supplier, but they really like it when that national supplier offers them the choice of a local supplier. Next slide, please. Aha. Okay, if you just click all the way through this, I think given the time, I'm not going to go into it, but keep clicking, keep going all the way through. I'll just do a very brief overview of this. Just keep going until you jump onto the next slide and go back one, I think. Go up and up two more. Whoops, click, sorry. Back to the diagram. There we are, that's perfect, let's stop there. I was going to run through this. I'm going to hand over to Alexandra, but this is a little bit about how we think about peer-to-peer or collective self-consumption. To give a very brief overview, what we think of doing is basically putting a wrapper around a whole group of assets like homes, industries, commercial buildings, some batteries, some integrated generation, and lots of control architecture to manage both the generation, the storage, and the demand. And then we use a range of technologies like Internet of Things, like smart contract technologies, automation, and machine learning and AI to make this system balance. And this gets back to another question that was asked earlier. All these bits of technology exist. We just haven't worked out how to put the whole system together within the existing regulatory system. But this is our vision about how the system will work. And this is what we're seeing a lot with the projects through the Global Observatory. So at this stage, we'll hand over to Alexandra, who I've cut down to only about 22 minutes. So sorry about that, Alexandra, I've gone a bit on.
That's okay. So 1 second. Can you guys see me? Okay, so I'm Alexandra and I'm a colleague of David's, and I am in charge of leading the Global Observatory on peer-to-peer communities of consumption and transactive energy models, which is a very long title, and we call it Go P2P. And can I have the next slide, please? So this is a project that falls under Technology Collaboration Program, and it's called the Users CCP, so it's centered on users, and David is the chair of the CCP. And this falls under the International Energy Agency. But this does not mean that we represent the IEA. We are independent of the IEA, so I just wanted to make that clear. Next slide, please. So the Global Observatory is the first international platform that gathers all the experts working on these peer-to-peer models. I also put down transactive energy because in the US, peer-to-peer is known more as transactive energy models, and communities of consumption because it can happen within a community setting. And we gather experts from industry, academia, nonprofits, so really people working from all kinds of sectors on developing these models. And at this pre-competitive stage, where there's experimentation happening, there is a need for an exchange of best practices and an exchange of ideas between the people working on these models. So this is what we aim to provide at an international level. Next slide, please. So we started about 2.5 years ago, and it says duration of 3.5 years, but I think it will be a bit longer than that because we have a bit of COVID delays. But we have 8 countries involved, which you can see on the slide here. So it's really countries from all over the world. Australia, US, UK, a bunch of European countries. And those countries, really, we will aim to look at how peer-to-peer is developed in those countries. So we will focus on those countries. But we have participants from 23 countries. So it really is an international network, including from Colombia. And we also have people from EIA University and others from other startups who are involved in developing pilots. And so we welcome more participants from Colombia. So you're very welcome to join if you're interested. Next slide, please. So our work is split up into different subtasks, and each subtask looks at an essential element of these peer-to-peer models. And by essential element, I mean that without these elements, these peer-to-peer models are not able to function. So for example, the integration of the models into the energy grid, looking at the type of technology to facilitate the trading of energy. So a lot of the models use blockchain technology, which can have additional risks, which I'll talk about in a bit. The market design, so how do you make sure that there's enough supply to meet the demand? And also the value. So why do people participate in these models? Is it more to make money, or is it more for the social value, so to help other people? And then the policy and regulation, as David mentioned, this is quite an important aspect because in a lot of countries, it's not legal to trade energy. So it's really, you know, without the regulation, peer-to-peer cannot take place. This is quite an important element. And all these different subtasks are then groups of people, of experts, and they're led by different leading institutions from across the world. So we have, for example, University of New South Wales in Australia, University of Colorado, Denver in the US, and Florence School of Regulation in Italy. And we, University College London, we are in charge of leading the Global Observatory. Next slide, please. So in terms of the work, so each subtask that I just told you about will be in charge of collecting information from case studies and pilots. For example, the Medellin pilot, which was carried out in Colombia. And then we will run an international comparative analysis, seeing what actually works or doesn't work with these models. And this is very important, especially for the International Energy Agency, because they really want to learn from, you know, what countries are doing and what works in one country, what doesn't work in one country. So it's really learning at international level, and that's what we're doing with this Global Observatory. And as I said, we want to see what works. So the common success factors, We also want to look at how ready a country is, and these will be the 8 countries that I told you were part of the observatory. So UK, US, Italy, Australia, Ireland, Switzerland, Netherlands, and Belgium. But the 200 participants are then welcome to join any of the subtasks according to their discipline. And then they will be contributing towards collecting data from the case studies. So next slide, please. So this is something that David put together. So I don't know if David, you want to say anything about this, or we can just skip it over because.
I think just, yeah, I think the main points here, because we've broken down the work into these different subtasks or different layers, we're really starting from at the bottom, the physics and engineering of grids. But also conceptually, it's useful to think about the fact that you've got different layers. You've got the grid physics layer. Overlaid on that, you've got the interests of individuals through transactions and markets, which are very focused on, how much money can I make, or what is in it for me. At the top, you've got these broader questions of economic and social value, but you've got these blue layers which really glue them together. So really the point of ICT and data is to try and align the physics of the grid with the transactions and markets. And the point of policy and regulation is to try and ensure that what happens at the individual level aligns with what happens at the collective level. And our case studies look at how we align different levels. So they're the thin black lines. And ultimately, if this is going to scale internationally, we have to get alignment through all of these. Otherwise, we'll have unintended consequences and disadvantages for different players. Thanks, Alexandra.
Thank you. So yeah, next slide, please. So before we go into looking at the case studies, what we've done is we've kind of seen what's the knowledge out there in the form of literature used. And we have several interesting findings, which you can see on the slide. So obviously the people that produce their own energy, prosumers, they play a central role in these models. But they need to be legally recognized. So they need to have the rights to trade energy, but also obligations for if something goes wrong. So it's really, there needs to be clarity around this. Also, they depend on entities to help them trade energy. So the platform providers, for example, this could be the retailer, which could provide the platform, or another organization, internet-based company. As David said, since these are services will be required, it's really important to have the service providers that are there to help the consumers. And as he also clarified, you also need to have multiple supplier models to make this possible. So not only having a retailer so your main energy company selling your energy, but also a neighbor, so you can trade energy to each other. In a lot of countries right now, this is not legal, so it's not possible. Next slide, please. In terms of motivations for participating, we found that it's very much value-driven, so really about helping others, helping the energy grid, and there's also no realistic picture of how much it would cost for a consumer to participate in these models, because there are additional costs that come into play here. As I said, there will be a platform necessary. So, a cost associated to the platform, in addition to the energy bill. And there's no clarity on how much it would actually cost for the consumer, how expensive it would be. Also, other risks are not foreseen in the literature, such as scalability. So at the moment, a lot of these pilots are with like 10, 20 participants, so very small. But in reality, in the real world, it will be with hundreds of people, thousands of people. And it's not clear yet if that works or how it would work. So there needs to be more research around this and more findings around this. Next slide, please. So in terms of my own research, so I've looked at sandboxes. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with these. But this is basically like, it's become very popular in Europe, and it's the regulator who provides an environment where experiments can take place, and the experiments do not follow all the laws. So they don't have to follow the laws in the energy code, for example, or the energy law. And there are a lot of peer-to-peer pilots taking place with blockchain. And as I said, it's becoming a very popular phenomenon, the sandbox. It's also with a limited number of consumers, limited amount of time, and really for the regulator to see how it works, and how the policies need to be changed in the long term based on the learnings from the experiments. Next slide, please. So I've put two examples of sandboxes here. You have the Dutch one, the Netherlands sandbox. So I'm Dutch. So I was able to look at all like the documents in Dutch and everything. And it's a very open sandbox. You can have up to 10,000 people participate, running their own network, their own grid, selling energy, producing energy, setting their own tariffs. So it really is all about the consumer and all about the consumer taking power and running their own peer-to-peer trading, for example. And it's open to energy cooperatives and housing associations. So it really has a focus on the consumer and groups of consumers. The UK one is quite different in that it also provides, as the Dutch one, exemptions from laws, but it only allows licensed companies to really run experiments. And by licensed companies, I mean like energy companies that have a license to produce and supply energy. So there can be like a main role for consumers in the experiments in the UK sandbox, which is problematic. And just to say, the Dutch sandbox was actually recently ended because the highest advisory organ of the Dutch government said that it was way too flexible and it was quite dangerous because consumers had so many freedoms in how they could experiment that it was actually dangerous for the grid, as they said it. I think it was a bad decision in my opinion, because I thought the sandbox was really very forward thinking compared to other sandboxes. It really, as I said, it allowed a lot of things for consumers to do. And let's face it, models such as peer-to-peer will be run by consumers will be very active in them. So in the sandbox, you really need to see, as I said, to what extent they have obligations, to what extent they're responsible if something goes wrong. So it's a shame that the Netherlands sandbox was ended. The UK sandbox is still running. Next slide, please. So I've looked at some practical limitations of the sandboxes. And as I said, there is, especially the UK one, there is very little representation of consumers because the experiments are led by companies. So they have the money to do it. They have the means to run the experiments. And interestingly, as I told you, the Netherlands sandbox, it was very consumer oriented, but most experiments were actually run by professional organizations because consumers did not have the time or the expertise to run the projects themselves. So it really also relied on companies as well. In terms of the laws that they could derogate from. So as I said, they have the right in the experiments, they don't have to follow all the laws, which is great because then you can see how things work, without the laws applying. But when it comes to peer-to-peer models and with all these services and consumers starting to sell energy, you have additional legal areas that become very important, such as contract law. If you have two consumers selling energy to one another, there's the question of two private individuals and contract law is applicable. Data privacy law, which is a big problem for blockchain, which is very popular in peer-to-peer. Because on the blockchain, it's very difficult to delete information and to change information. So especially in Europe, where we have the right to be forgotten, where a consumer can ask for information to be removed, with a blockchain, this is practically impossible. So there are a lot of laws that are not applicable in the sandbox, such as data privacy and contract law. And this is a shame because the sandbox does not provide then a realistic picture of how this could happen in real life. So in that sense, the sandboxes are very limited at the moment. Next slide, please. I also found that there were very little results publicly available of the experiments. I think the only one I saw was really the UK sandbox, where they kind of provided like summaries, very brief summaries. I mean, obviously it's to protect the companies participating, so there are business interests. But I think, you know, people who are not able to participate in the sandbox should also be able to learn from the experiments, because not everyone can participate in them. So this was, I think, problematic, that there was no transparency or very little transparency as regards experiments. Also, there's a lack of financial help and short timeframes. Obviously the companies have the money, so they're the ones running the experiments, which, as I said, is a problem because community energy groups and consumers are not represented then, because they cannot take a lead in the experiments. And in the UK case, the experiments can only be 2 years. This includes setting up the pilots, running it, and dismantling it. And that is a very short amount of time for all of that stuff, especially to learn from it. The Netherlands has 10 years, which I think is very long, but still a good amount of time for experiments, because then you can really, you know, see what happens with consumers taking this active role. And even though the sandbox in the Netherlands has ended, the pilots that were granted in the past years are still running, and they still have 10 years to run. So in that sense, it will be useful. Next slide, please. So is there actually a need for a sandbox? Well, as I said, there's a lack of transparency, and this is a problem because there are so little applications that actually make it into the sandboxes. So the regulator is usually in charge of running the sandbox, and they have very clear requirements as to who can enter the sandbox. And most of them are rejected because they're not innovative enough, or because they ask for too many derogations from the law. So yeah, in a way, it's quite a low number of experiments taking place. There's also little evidence of how efficient the sandboxes are, because it's quite a new thing. If you think about it, it was only started really a few years ago. And it's now popping up in many countries, but it's not clear to what extent the sandboxes actually change regulation. However, I do think, and this is something that David also said, that it is extremely important for policymakers to really get their act together in terms of keeping up to date with the innovation and making sure that they learn from what happens with innovation at the same time as innovation is moving. Because at the moment, the laws and the policies are way behind the innovation, which is a problem. So I think the sandbox in that sense could be a good tool to allow policymakers to learn in real time, and not just temporary, but I think a long-term tool. I think it's not just for a few years, it should be for the coming decade at least. So I think Ofgem, the UK regulator, has summarized it very well. They said, don't assume that the sandbox changes regulation, it's just a learning environment. And I think that basically sums up the role of the sandbox at the moment, also for peer-to-peer energy trading. Next slide, please. So I've just added the sources to the literature reviews and to the sandbox paper that I wrote. Next slide, please. So thank you very much. And if you are interested in the Global Observatory, as I said, we have people from Colombia involved, so you're very welcome to also join our international network. Please send me an email. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask them. En español también, entiendo español, no hay problema. So thank you. Bye-bye.